So tiny homes may or may not be cheaper than conventional regular homes. Tiny homes have the advantage of using a lot less energy. If you have a lot less floor space to energize, to heat, to cool, to have piping and wiring and water running throughout that structure, then it would be presumably a lot cheaper. A lot less materials, a lot less energy. Should be a lot less cost. But again, it may not be significantly lower as compared to a regular home. It may be just slightly lower. So you may have to consider your options of going tiny against going with a low-cost regular home. If you're purchasing, renting, especially when considering things like energy costs and your taxes, and even cost of the structure of the house, of the entire property, it may be very comparable. Sometimes the same, sometimes more than your conventional home. So unless you, again, are one of those tiny minority that can build that home from the ground up, it is very difficult to save money, because tiny homes are quite rare when you compare it with the availability of other homes, of regular low-cost conventional homes. So the demand for them, as their popularity has increased, the demand has increased, thus their cost. Usually, of course, there's always going to be one or two or a few good deals out there. Some of them may be very good deals, some of them may be unbelievable deals, very good and hard to find. But don't count on them, don't hold your breath for that, because they may or may not be readily available in the area that you are looking to live. Yes, they may be a lot more options in other areas where you'd rather not be. And tiny home communities are popping up all over the country. They have been approved by communities and cities more and more. Just about in every state, you're going to find communities of tiny homes where people come and bring their home. A lot of times what these people do is they buy a tiny home and they can be towed on wheels, towed to the location where you're going to pretty much park it and live. Of course, paying rent. The landlord, the owner of the land or the lot where the tiny home is to be, or the community, tiny home community. So you need to consider that. You need to consider the fact that in a lot of cases, tiny home communities are basically on private lands, and you're paying rent. You're leasing that spot where you're going to live out of your tiny home. So you have to consider the cost of that lease, that rent for that plot of land, and the cost of the tiny home itself. Whether you're paying for it, whether you have paid for it outright, whether you have built it, there's a cost involved. You have to consider all of that. And of course, there's many limitations with tiny homes. The first of them being the space available. Limitations with storage, limitations with living with others, living with animals, living with even one more person could be a problem, especially if the person has any kind of health limitations, health problems. If any of the people that live in the tiny home have any kind of requirements when it comes to space, some people may be obese on the heavy side, and that may limit their ability to live in a very small space. Some people may be on wheelchairs. That also has its space requirements. Some people may have a career that they have to have materials and equipment stored for use or for sale, or to do business, to run their operations. A tiny home may limit such people. There may also be parking limitations in those tiny home communities. They are tiny home communities, so they're going to have limited space, even for vehicles. So there may be limitations in parking near your tiny home, especially if you have a bigger vehicle. If you have a vehicle for business, like a pickup truck or van, you may have to park across the street. You may have to park away from where you live. If you have a truck, if you drive a bucket truck or some sort of bread truck or a delivery truck, then parking right in front of your tiny home may not be an option. If you have more than one vehicle, if you have 2 vehicles, 3 vehicles, as some people have 4 vehicles, then you may not be able to park most of your vehicles close to where you live. Another limitation for tiny homes may be your ability to have a yard. You may not be able to have a yard. You may have one that's quite small, but if you want to do any kind of work, any kind of projects, any kind of installation, you may cause an eyesore for your neighbors. They may not want to hear you banging on stuff, cutting stuff. If you're the type that likes to build, fix, tinker with, and modify, and have hobbies outdoors and work on stuff, and you have to do it outside, and living in a tiny home may limit you in that way, may cause you to have to do those things elsewhere and perhaps pay for another spot for you to build, to do, to fix anything that you would want. Working on vehicles may be out of the question. Working on things like installation of solar panels, solar energy equipment, batteries may be out of the question. Installing a wind turbine may be out of the question, even if it's in your property, because your neighbors are just going to hate you, dislike you, complaints, call the police on you, call the city, the county on you, and even sue you for whatever it is that they are upset about, whether it's noise, whether it's installing equipment and causing an eyesore, you working all the time and just disturbing what they perceive to be the peace. So you may have a lot of problems with that, because tiny homes, again, are usually in tiny home communities. Of course, you can have a tiny home and move it out into a very private area, a larger area, and you can have that tiny home there in that piece of land where you may be out in the woods, the country, you may be out in the desert, you may be out in a very large lot with neighbors that are, quite separated and, sparse, and it may not be a problem like that. However, there may be a problem with city or town or county ordinances, building codes, etc. So you have to be very careful and follow your area's construction requirements, construction codes, and make sure that you don't violate those, because they may come and tell you to tear your house down, literally destroy your house, because it is violating code, building code, and they may have the legal right to tell you that that house, that building must be moved out, destroyed, or you may not be able to live in it. You may be condemned, impounded, whatever the case. So think about all that. Tiny homes, again, are a very good option for some people, but not the best option for others, especially when it comes to all of the factors I just mentioned. Energy savings, it may or may not be an energy saving. Also, cost to build, to live in it, and all of the limitations that may come with living in a tiny home. We'll pick it up in the next chat on this subject. We'll leave it at that for now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please look for the next episode soon. And please ensure you like this content and subscribe as a sign of support for me to continue to provide this type of content to people like you. Thank you.